But I'm not really at this point thinking of having a conversation about Pakistan. I want to have a conversation about the world, about the issues that really matter. No conversation seems to be complete without this when I'm sitting somewhere. It's pathetic how we haven't been able to pull the poor up. First thing I want to know is who's leaking this information.
Well, I cannot.
Somebody's breaching that trust.
Welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where we put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders of the world. Joining us today is former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and author of multiple books on public policy and international relations, and also the co-founder and strategic advisor for Infer. None other than Dr. Moeed Yusuf himself. Dr. Yusuf, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. So you've been away from the limelight for a bit, and now you're coming into the public eye through this platform. So what was the motivation behind putting your attention and your time behind something like Infer, especially considering the fact that you come from a more public policy and international relations background?
I think that's a fair question. If you allow me, I'll take a minute and just explain. One learns from experiences, and my experience as the National Security Advisor, I think, was priceless in terms of better understanding what are some of the things one can do when you're out of public office. I firmly believe that every citizen of any country, including Pakistan, you have a role to play. You've just got to identify, no matter how small and how modest that role is, you've got to identify how you can contribute to society. So in my case, I walked away with 2 or 3 conclusions, given my background. One of them was that the future of Pakistan is the youth. And if you are unable to engage the young men and women of this country constructively, the number is so large that you will actually end up pushing the entire society and system into a negative direction. So I thought through what would be the modes of engagement for somebody like me with young men and women of this country. So there are 2 that are priorities for me at this point. One is going back to teaching. So since I left government, I'm back into teaching and working with a couple of universities, advising them on how to change models of engagement with youth. The second one is information. Because I hate to say this, but perhaps your generation, which I no longer belong to, the real youth of this country are actually absorbing information in a very different way. You're on the Twitters and the Instagrams of the world, and people like me, when we speak, when we write, when we talk, I feel you miss us. You're not really interested in the way we are communicating and what we are communicating. The digital space is the future. That's where information is being picked up. How do you engage this kind of conversation for people who are educated, who don't want to be in this mudslinging sort of conversation which much of the global media today, unfortunately, has fallen prey to? And so there I thought, what's a conversation to have as Pakistan with the world and with the youth of this country, right?
And what's the conclusion you reached on that?
And the conclusion for now is Infer, right? The conclusion is that we want a conversation which is critical, which is objective, which is nuanced, which doesn't talk about the here and now, which talks to the world as global citizens would do about issues that are global, about issues that we think Pakistanis are not interested in, the world's youth is not interested in. But frankly, if you look at any data point, it tells you that the youth of this world are smarter than the older generation, are more knowledgeable, and are craving for intellectual discourse rather than simply, a media that chases ratings. So that's, I would say, the starting point of this, if you will. That doesn't mean I've moved away from public policy. I'm actively working on think tanks, including setting up some spaces and many other things that tie into public policy. But this particular one, you're right, is new, but I think is very much the need of the hour.
I would like to present this question to you with the premise that As we see an overload on broadcast media, a similar trend is happening on digital platforms as well. There's an overload of information. Some of it is reliable, most of it might not be. So, what would your advice to an avid content consumer?
Frankly, I don't have advice. I don't know. I mean, there are people who would do this much better than me. I have chosen to invest in a conversation as a supplier of information. So if you think of this platform, or if you think of, frankly, teaching for that matter, or if you think of public policy and analysis, you are supplying information, analysis, and data to the consumer. So for the consumer, there is a real conversation to be had. But where I am focused is, how do you present something different in a different way so that the conversation is intellectual? You may find it surprising coming from me, but I'm not really at this point thinking of having a conversation about Pakistan. I want to have a conversation about the world, with the world, the youth of the world, and the youth of this country, about the issues that really matter, about issues of climate change. If we don't address those, unfortunately, the new generation will not have a place to live in this world, right? I want to talk about what a civic global citizen is. Must we always get stuck on parochial, quote unquote, interests that are tied to ethnicity or a province or a nationality? Can't we talk as global citizens and acknowledge that, frankly, we've made a bit of a mess of this place? And all of us need to come together, rise above those barriers, and start having objective conversations about what it takes to break the barrier of becoming a real global citizen and working towards outcomes that are going to benefit all. This doesn't mean that, we're not talking about Pakistan. Even Pakistan should be telling a story which fits into that global landscape. Other countries should be telling Pakistan and Pakistani stories that actually can be absorbed by Pakistanis in the way it's intended. And if I may say so, I think, I didn't find that Pakistan or many other countries were doing a good job engaging the new generation that's going to be the make or break for Pakistan and the world. That's really where I think this is going to go. My hope is, and again, all of you are going to be the faces of this and running this. My hope is that your consumer and your audience can critique, can question, but can never say that you're not talking about really important issues in an objective manner without bias. You are not chasing ratings, but you're chasing real content that educates our youth to make better decisions going forward for this country and for the world.
Can you share with us what you mean by that? What is the benchmark for a global citizen? What would that kind of a perspective look like?
In terms of information, the first thing you have to do is identify what is important. Not only because I am invested in this or I like to talk about it, but what does the world need to talk about, right? Second, how do you ensure that you get every perspective on that particular issue and present it to your audience for them to decide which side of the divide they want to fall on? Not to pretend that I've given you the whole story while just perpetuating a bias that you or I or anybody else may have. Look, I'm a big believer that you can't hide quality for too long. Bad quality will come out and good quality will come out, right? If you look at the industry leaders, you may agree or disagree, but at the end of the day, you will put your hand up and say they do professional work. So in the information space, what is professional? What is professional is you remove your biases, you have real nuanced conversations, and let your audience make up their mind of where they want to go, right? There are very, very big names today that started from a very small scale, but actually developed quality. There are many others who've got multi-million-dollar investments, but people would point and say, no, this is actually biased this way or that way. That's not the vision here. Why do I think this is important? Because you've got a whole class of youth in this world, and including in Pakistan, who have become divorced from their own societies and from the real issues that beset their societies. Right. How do you break them out of that bubble and have conversations that are going to really matter at the end of the day? That's the question. So, An English speaker in the world that looks at Pakistan has a perception created by ratings based media, right? Somebody sitting in Latin America looks at a particular country like Pakistan or another country through whatever lens has been put to them. But for a country of 220 million, is that all there is to it? Must we only talk about politics that's parochial? Must we only talk about a particular interest that may be parochial? If you're sitting in another country, would you not have an interest in knowing that Pakistan has the most glacial ice outside of the Arctic anywhere in the world and what that means? Would Pakistanis not want to hear that a particular country in another continent specializes in something that ties up with our culture? Right? Those are the real conversations that I think we need to get to, and to start creating a global network for young men and women to talk beyond a mental block or a boundary which may be national, which may be ethnic, which may be others, to start thinking through how do we move forward as a global community, but also very clearly have a view of a country of 220 million people and have a conversation where we learn from others and others learn about us.
Climate change was also mentioned in the national security policy. It's the first of its kind for Pakistan, and it's a very thorough and very detailed document at that. And it covers a lot of areas from traditional security to non-traditional human security aspects as well. How do you think it's going to take root? How do you think it is going to be taken forward by incumbent administrations? And what are your hopes for it at this point?
No conversation seems to be complete without this when I'm sitting somewhere. Look, I mean, I think it's fair. First of all, let me just say, the national security policy is Pakistan's policy. It's not Moeed Yusuf's policy. I was in an office and many before me who worked on that. It's a national document. It's a document that actually needs a lot of time to implement. So my hope for that is that it's implemented in earnest because it has a consensus around it and it gives Pakistan a fundamentally new direction of where we're going. It announces to the world it's a statement of intent for the world on where Pakistan is going. But let me tie it in with what we were talking about. I think the world must be interested in knowing where the fifth, sixth largest country of the world, who's always seen as a very important country, a pivotal country, wants to go over the next 10 to 20 years. Right? The conversation is not whether Pakistan is good or bad, whether this will work out or not. The conversation is that I want to see connectivity for Pakistan and the region where billions of people languish in poverty. Right? I want to talk about how this concept of geoeconomics that came up after the Cold War, frankly, not as a benign concept. It was seen as a tool of statecraft to be used as opposed to wars. You would use economic warfare to further your interests. Pakistan is presented in entirely benign form of geoeconomics where it says, let's figure out how to bypass global contestation and find ways where we could create a melting pot of positive economic interests. Why? Because we want to focus on human security. We've got a huge problem of millions of people languishing in poverty. We want to pull them up. How do we pull them up? Through economic security, by generating more revenues, increasing the size of our national economic pie. How do you do that? Through development partnerships, through connectivity. Is anything that I've said specific to Pakistan? No. There are any number of countries who find themselves in exactly the same position. Priorities may not have worked out. They may not be where they needed to be. But if you want to focus on human security, and every country in the world would, we have a template. Let's start talking about it and see what works for us, what may work for another country. But the template is very simple. You've got to focus on economic security, whatever endowments you have as a country, to shift all the resources to ensure human welfare. That's a universal principle at this point. When the world is struggling as much as it is, finite resources are actually disappearing into conflict. This is the time to think about how there could be cross-national coordination and cooperation to find ways to connect for the benefit of the poor of the world. And I will say this proudly, that I think, we looked at virtually the entire world's national security constructs. I think there's a bit of a pioneering that came out in our national security policy, and it's a conversation that should be picked up by the world. And I hope that your outlet and others can have these kind of conversations without talking about Pakistan's national security, but really the concept and how we move forward and where our audience and the youth of the world fit in to push that vision ahead.
That's very rightly pointed out on the power of economics and how we can invest our time in that more. You also mentioned that it is high time that we should work towards the collective benefit of the poor of the world. But what incentive do you see for the collective rich of the world to invest themselves in that project?
I think the whole house of cards will come crumbling down if we don't. I mean, look at where we are now. Look at the amount of resources in the hands of a very, very small minority globally, but then in every country. I mean, Pakistan is no exception to that. You can look at other countries. If we haven't woken up to the fact that the global international post-World War II order is in real trouble, partly because so few people have managed to usurp so much of the resources, then I don't know when we'll wake up. You're seeing an entire wave of political change around the world, with leaders coming in with little experience, but making the case that you've got a fundamentally unfair system, and people voting for that. That's a wake-up call, right? If we are not going to be able to find ways to increase global wealth and then redistribute it somewhat fairly, you'll never have a fair distribution, but somewhat fairly or somewhat better, I would say, I think this entire model risks collapse. I mean, just look around and see what is happening in the world. We are not a happy planet in any way. And I can get into my small little issues, the day-to-day ones, and in the grand scheme of things, even a national issue may not be as big. But we've got to think through how the new generation, the younger generation, understands the responsibility bestowed on them, given that the world is not in a happy place. And that conversation, to my mind, is neither about publicity, neither about populism, nor about ratings, nor about fake news. It requires deep reflection. And a lot of people frankly tell me that, it can never happen on media. I'm not so sure. I think we don't give our younger generation enough credit. They do want to hear positive stories about who they are and where they're going. They do want to hear objective views, but most importantly, they want to hear how to fix things. And if we are not able to provide them that guidance, then clearly they're going to be derailed, and it's going to be a problem for countries and the world. That's where I think a very small part can be played by outlets like Infer. Have real conversations, let people absorb them. You're not going to get overnight change, but I guarantee you will start getting a conversation going, which millions in this world and in this country are craving, but are not getting.
On the phrase that you used of us not being a happy planet, what are some of the real and present examples of that manifesting? What is making the planet unhappy?
Look, I mean, one can go on and on, right? But I mean, you are living in a 21st century environment where you've got a major military conflict and a real conversation about escalation, which is unthinkable, right? Post-Cold War, you didn't think Europe was going to be in the kind of military conflict that they're in, but they are in, right? And that's where we are. Climate change, we've just had COP in Cairo. You've heard the kind of horror stories. You've heard where this planet is heading. I've talked about inequality and poverty. Those are real issues. The people who are poor are human. The elite of the world has to own up to that responsibility. It's a right of the poor to actually have redistribution. That was the entire promise, and it isn't delivering. But overall, I also think that we are, as a global community, depending too much on short-term band-aid fixes to big problems. The world is polarizing, so to say. There is a real civilizational divide. It's subliminal, but unfortunately, you can just look at the commentary happening from all sides around the FIFA World Cup. You can cast a shadow on that as just politics, but I think there's something deeper there. You can look at the commentary that the youth of the world have on climate change, right? And where countries stand on climate change, there's a huge gap. There are national interests that are pulling people or countries away from taking up responsibility. And then there are millions of minds in the world who are saying, this is crazy. You're leaving us with a planet that is simply not going to be, we can't inhabit at the end of the day. So all of that, tells me that there are real issues that we want to talk about. You talk about important, strong, powerful countries, and you still see the poverty around. Just look at the region that we sit in. Look at South Asia. Look at countries and look at the population and look at the number of poor. We can declare countries strong and powerful, but when you dig deep, it's pathetic how we haven't been able to pull the poor up. We haven't been able to find ways in various aspects to really give the kind of dignity I think that human beings deserve. So those are real issues. You have one conflict in the world. You've got energy supply shortages. You've got prices skyrocketing. You've got inflation around the world. Pakistan, for instance, has nothing to do with the conflict physically. Wheat prices up, energy prices up, and suddenly you've got a real economic crisis. So the world is so interconnected and globalized that if the problems are connected, the solutions must be connected as well.
I can't help but feel a sense of optimism, when you speak about how the younger people are taking up responsibility. Like, for example, around the conversations around FIFA and how, certain human rights abuses are being highlighted. But at the same time, state narratives are also being challenged. So
yeah, I'm actually perhaps at the polar opposite point as far as my view is concerned. I'm not optimistic in that sense. I think I'm realistic about the fact that if it's not going to be the next generation, we are doomed. So I'm not even at the point where I would say to you that they consume information and do better things with it than the previous generation. My point is, we are not feeding the right information in the right manner to the young generation. And if we are not going to do that, to expect them to somehow miraculously come up with the right solutions and to be real civic citizens and to change things for the better, I think we're asking for too much. It is our responsibility to provide them with the right tools, information being one critical tool. And yes, they are smart enough, knowledgeable enough, and astute enough to then know what to do with it. But at least get the supply of information right and in somewhat objective terms across to this young population, across, frankly, to the policymaker of the world, right? If policymakers of the world do not understand what a country like Pakistan or any country in the world stands for, how are you going to make right decisions, right? You tell me, how many times has it happened that somebody outside of Pakistan has spoken about Pakistan, a policymaker, policy influencer, somebody known, or just otherwise, whether social media or any public statement, and you say, my God, they're so ignorant about our country. This is not who we are. Yes, this may be a slice, but what about the 98% of the rest of Pakistan that nobody is talking about? How many times have you gone through that?
It's almost always.
Okay, the problem is that the information is not relayed in the right manner and is not out there for people to pick up, to understand what a particular segment of society or a society of 220 million people may stand for. Now, the job is not to convince them about what you like or to convince them that we are great and others may not be. The job is to present objectively who you are and let the others make up their mind. But it is the responsibility on the supply side to put this information out, and it's the responsibility of the audience and the receiver to get all that information to make that decision. If the only conversation is going to be a small slice, self-serving slice, unfortunately the conclusions are going to be wrong. That is real, I think, that's real information production. Every country has a right to do that, every society has it, every identity has that, and you must do that. But if that's not happening, then the right decisions won't come about. Yes, there's a big problem on the receiving end as well. You can choose to pick information that you like. But if you start putting out objective, nuanced, credible information enough times, you will be heard enough times. That's the view I have. Again, it's not a Pakistan-specific comment, but I think we really need to move to that level of maturity.
So everyone's engaged in the subject of what's happening in the here and now. But how do you see Pakistan in the next decade? How do you see Pakistan's future rooted in the context that we're speaking of right now? And how do you see Pakistan emerging out of it?
I don't know if there's an answer to where do I see Pakistan in 10 years, because where Pakistan will be in 10 years depends entirely on the decisions you and I and those who have been given the authority and power and responsibility to make decisions, make them. If we make the right decisions, there is absolutely no reason for a country of our size, location that we have, the endowments, natural endowments that we have in terms of human capital and otherwise, to proceed in a direction that we all want. You talked about the national security policy earlier. It's a statement of intent that lays out the vision of where we want to go. You need to take decisions to implement things, and you'll start moving in that direction. If we don't want to do that, if we are not willing to change, if we are willing to close our eyes to the painful decisions that we, like many other countries in the world today, need to take, we'll be in a fairly bad place. Worse than we are today. Right? So I'm not a fan of passive conversations about where a country will be. A country will be where its people take it. We may not have taken the country in the direction we wanted, or maybe some of the things have worked out and others haven't. At any given point in time, the decision on where our country or any other country in the world will be in the next 10 years is in the hands of those who have the choice to make those decisions. It's not only leadership. You and I also have to make that choice. Infer is a choice. There may be many others that you and I make. How do we all collectively build up to that end point, that statement of intent, that vision, that I say NSP, but you can take any. Where is it that we need to go? How do we get there? That's the conversation we need to have. Who needs to do what for us to make it? That's where the implementation comes. So I'm not one of those who's going to be despondent just because things don't look good today. Nor am I going to be super optimistic because somebody can tell me things are looking good at this point in time. I want to know what my plan is to go from point A to point B in 10 years. Point B, we know that journey we have to define, right? It's totally on us to take Pakistan where we say we want to take it. And if we fail, don't blame Pakistan, blame ourselves.
So, Dr. Yusuf, we've touched on some very serious topics throughout this conversation. But I have received some information that informs me that you are seen by your colleagues as somewhat of a workaholic. So what I would like for you to comment on is, do you agree with this title that has been given to you? And what is it about your work that you derive? Do you derive joy from your work? And if yes, what is it about your work
First thing I want to know is who's leaking this information.
Well, I cannot
Somebody's
reveal my sources.
breaching that trust. If the only thing you've heard about me from my colleagues is that they call me a workaholic, I'm very happy with that. Because I think there is much worse coming your way if you find out. Look, I mean, I think that's entirely true. I won't even hide it. And I don't even think I'm an easy person to work with, frankly. I think I'm a very difficult person to work with. And there's a reason for that. If you are given responsibility and you walk away from that responsibility after a day, 6 months, a year, or 5 years, I'm speaking from my perspective, without tangible change that can be associated with your and your team's efforts, you basically wasted your time and everybody else's time. So the only thing that excites me about work is change. So you'll almost never find me take challenges where a running institution needs to be run again, or things that are functional to just simply continue functioning. You'll always find me pick up new things, broken things, to remake, to make, to shape. That's what excites me. But when you want to do that, you can't work 8-hour days. You've got to put in 16-hour days. And the reason I'm a terrible boss or colleague is that anybody who doesn't work 16-hour days, I don't have much patience for, which is terrible because people have families, people have to create a work-life balance. Doesn't exist in my life. So far it hasn't. Simple as that.
So I think I'll take that to suffice that your colleagues are right about you.
Yeah, that's fine. If that's, as I said, if that's the only thing they're saying, that's fine. But I'll also make a very serious point. If the younger generation of this country feels that 8-hour days are what are going to get this country to point B, the A to B, you're sadly mistaken. So I think everybody needs to buckle up and we need to get rid of this mentality that I'm entitled to do this or that. Yes, you are entitled, but change is not going to come that way. That's the status quo business as usual approach. I don't think we're going to make it if we do that. The point B is going to come from a effort that goes way beyond the call of duty. And we just need to make sure that for the next 10, 15, 20 years, that generation owns up to that change. And then you can go to 3-day weekends and 4-day weekends if you like. That'll be your choice.
Thank you so much for taking out the time to speak with us today. Before we let you go, I would like to present my last question to you, which is, we've talked about the future of Pakistan, where the world is headed, but let's come down to a more micro level, a more involved project. Where do you see Infer in a year from now?
I see the platform having created a global audience that comes to listen to your products, output, and the information you generate because they find it credible. Even if they disagree with it, they cannot say that this is biased in a particular direction or is propaganda or is poor quality information. I want young men and women of Pakistan and the world to come and listen to this platform because they gain new knowledge. They can then determine where they stand on any issue and what their views are. I think if you can create a mark for yourself as a platform that is seen as credible beyond the boundaries of Pakistan, you would have made a very, very good start.
Well, I guess that gives us our vision statement. And thank you so much for tuning into this conversation. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a like and comment what kind of topics you'd like for us to tackle next. Our social media is given in the description below. We'd love to see you there. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel.